welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
Today we're going to be diving into Johanna's Blood on Her Tongue, and I just want to share with you my favorite lines from the book. It reads, "I put my thumbs through his eyes, the way you told me to. Should I ever be assaulted? And then I stabbed him in the throat with a pin. Blood sprouted out of his neck with such force, it was like a fountain."
That's your favorite line.
Yes, choose, literally choose.
Well, I'm Shaun, and for today's show, I have a special guest. That would be Kendra. Hi, Kendra.
Hello.
So Kendra and I went to grad school together like 1,000 years ago. It feels like it. Yeah, a little long. And then today, Kendra and I are joined by Dutch writer Johanna van Veen. Welcome to the show.
Hi guys, thank you for having me.
So Johanna grew up in the Netherlands as one of a triplet of sisters. She earned both an MA in English Literature and Digital Media from Leiden University. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, cool. I got one thing right. I'm off to a good start. I got a specialization in early modern book history, which I'm going to ask you about later because that sounds really fun. She is the author of the queer gothic horror novels My Darling Dreadful Thing from 2024, and the book we're here to talk about that is out this year, 2025, which is Blood on Her Tongue.
Before we get into discussion, a reminder to our listeners, please share your questions and comments with us at skiffyandfanty.com /listener suggestions. If you aren't already, join us on Twitch for Shaun's Alphabet streams every Friday at 7 p.m. Central to be a part of our interactive live stream show format. Finally, be sure to review and spread the word about our show. Help support us through our Patreon and be part of our Torture cinema polls, live watches, or other special Patreon-only events on Discord.
Yay! All right, first question. Can you tell us a little bit about Blood on Her Tongue?
Yes, it's a gothic horror novel set in 1887 in the Netherlands, and it focuses on twin sisters Sarah and Lucy, or Sarah and Lucy, if you want to go by the Dutch pronunciation. And Sarah is married to a wealthy man, and they find a bog body on his estate. Sarah is very scientifically minded, so she's obviously very interested in this bog body. And very quickly after its discovery, she becomes ill with what the doctor thinks is a fever of the brain, which causes temporary insanity. So her sister is asked to come and care for her for a while. But the longer Lucy is with her, the more she starts to question whether this diagnosis is correct, and the more she starts to suspect that maybe something supernatural is going on.
Okay, so I have to ask about the bog bodies, because that's a real thing. Bog bodies, like, legit exist, and they're out there, and people have found them. And so I assume some research went into this, and I was hoping you could tell a little bit about, like, how you kind of came up with the idea. What kind of research on bog bodies did you do, and how did it kind of inform the book?
I mean, I love bog bodies. I think they're very fascinating. So they are basically bodies that are found in bogs, and they're preserved by bogs due to a combination of like a lack of oxygen and the acidity in the actual water. So bog is a kind of swamp. You find them in parts of Europe, so Ireland, England, Denmark, the Netherlands, I think Sweden as well, Poland, and Germany. Those are the main areas, and in Florida as well. I think people always it's always a surprise to people that the US also has bogs, but you guys do, and you also have bog bodies, in fact. But the interesting thing about bog bodies is that they span a really long stretch of time, because the only requirement is that people died in the bog, or they were thrown in the bog after they died and their body was preserved. So I think the most recent ones we know about are actually from the Second World War. I think Russian soldiers who drowned in the bog during a military operation. And the oldest ones go back thousands of years. So that is really fascinating. And the interesting thing is, if you've ever seen a bog body in a museum, right now they don't look like that much. They kind of look like leather. But if you find them, like the moment you find them, you pull them out, they are super well preserved generally. So well preserved that it's just from looking at them, it's super hard to tell how old they are. They could have died a few weeks ago, they could have been like 3,000 years old. So that is very fascinating. And then I think what like makes them so fascinating is that, especially for the older ones, they can tell us a lot about the way people used to live. So we have a few bog bodies in the Netherlands from, say, around 2,000 years old, so around the time the Romans invaded. And there's we don't know that much about the people who lived in the Netherlands then, except for Roman sources, which are very biased, obviously. So it's very interesting to find these bodies and to then do research into them and discover, for example, what did these people eat, how did they dress themselves, and at the same time, there is this mystery of how did they end up in the bog? Was this murder? Is this a ritual sacrifice? Was this an accident? It's possible that all three are correct depending on what body you're looking at, but we know for almost like certainly that a bunch of these people were probably ritualistically sacrificed and thrown in the bog to appease some sort of entity.
Oh, well, that's terrifying. Okay.
Hardcore, yeah.
Yeah. So part of what I found really fascinating in the way you treat it, you've mentioned this before, which is with Sarah. You know, so part of the way the book's told is there are letters. So we get letters and inscriptions and marginalia that is also presented. And you'd mentioned that Sarah is more scientifically minded. And so I think one of my really early fascinations was how much her approach to the discovery of a bog body is to like try to figure out, almost like an anthropologist, like what had gone on. Naturally, that in this book, because it's a sort of gothic horror novel, that leads to disturbing questions and disturbing answers. Excuse me, there is somebody decided to mow the lawn literally right when we started. Apologies. And so I was hoping to kind of talk about, because Sarah is a twin as well. You could kind of talk about Sarah's mindset and how you kind of developed her character, and that'll probably lead us into some avenues of what happens to her her character, unfortunately.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do with this bog body, and through the character of Sarah is sort of approach how people would approach these bog bodies in the 19th century. Because nowadays, I mean, we don't really find many bog bodies anymore. It's one of the great tragedies, I would say, of science, that a lot of these bodies were uncovered in a time where people did not know how to preserve them or could not preserve them. So we do know of certain bodies that were found in the 19th century where people would treat them as like genuine murder cases, and they would do autopsies on them and basically treat them not that differently from how we would treat a murder case now. I mean, like nowadays, right? Like a fresh murder case, let's put it like that, not an archaeological find. So that was something that I thought was interesting to explore, like how these people treat a bog body as compared to how we would do it nowadays. And I thought it would be interesting to show a female character with a scientific mindset. The Victorian era is very much, it has a very strict gender binary where like the house is the area where the woman needs to thrive. It's her domain. Then we have like the workplace that's for men, and there's all these like it's very interesting how they sort of create this binary. And it includes so much. Like if you look at, for example, nowadays where we think, oh, pink is for girls and blue is for boys, the Victorians did that into the extreme. So they had like personality traits that were considered feminine or masculine colors, types of wood, for example. If you made your furniture out of certain woods, like certain woods were not appropriate for female rooms. So you had female rooms and male rooms in the house. And I thought that was interesting to use for Sarah because Sarah's scientific mindset is not very, is not considered very feminine. So you immediately bring in this tension of gender and like what people expect from women. And at the same time, right, because that's what Victorians thought, like, oh, this is a very masculine thing, this is a very feminine thing. And of course, we know that that's not really how it works. There have always been very scientifically minded women. But yeah, so I thought it would be interesting to sort of drag that in, because it's on the one hand, it's necessary for the plot, right? If Sarah wasn't interested in this book body, we wouldn't be going anywhere. And on the other hand, it immediately creates this tension and feeds into certain themes that the book tries to discuss.
Kendra, do you want to jump in?
I want to jump in.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I mean, I love this book. I think that I'm going through this whole bog body phase in literature right now, and Johanna and I sat down together not too long ago and discussed bog bodies and other avenues of Dutch folklore, and really started to uncover a lot. And so, yeah, I think it's really, really cool that she is kind of bringing this back to the surface, and it's getting a lot of people really engaged and really interested in the discussion surrounding bogs and bodies. I think you mentioned earlier, Shaun, how you think of bog bodies, you think of like the UK and England, and the wetlands there and the marshes there, and they exist here too in the Netherlands, and as Johanna said, also in Florida. And so it's a big thing in literature right now. This topic of bog bodies.
Interesting. So, well, now I have to ask questions about the folklore of the Netherlands. Does that, because I don't know anything about, I mean, I'm sure I've seen some things, but I won't profess to have knowledge. Is that something that feeds into this book as well? Whether that's to do with bogs or just culturally? Is that something I'm missing as someone who's not super familiar with the culture?
I would say that's more a thing with my first novel, my Dark Dreadful Thing. Like that was a book where certain people really struggled with the setting, or they were like, "Oh, when is this set?" Which I found interesting because it mentioned several Dutch cities, etc. And I think my Dark Dreadful Thing is quintessentially Dutch in a way that I find hard to describe. But I think there is something very Dutch about that book. I think that's less the case with Blood on Her Tongue, but the folklore surrounding at least the way the book body is buried is based on historical evidence. And I mean, this is not a spoiler because the uncovery of the book body is literally in the first chapter. But this body is buried in a way that is very disturbing to the people who found it because it's basically being buried face down. It's been staked down, and it has a big stone crammed in its mouth. And we have found a body like that in the Netherlands. Not like I think it was, I have to say, maybe 13th or 14th century. I would have to check when exactly this person was buried that way. But that suggests that people in the Netherlands believed in some sort of revenant myth, like that being real, because the only reason why you would bury somebody like that is if you are afraid they might come back. So to stake them down, right, you keep them from moving. Burying them face down is sort of prevent them from clawing their way back up. The idea is that the dead person is confused and they will like bury in deeper. The rock in the mouth is to prevent them from eating. So that at least, like, that is not something that is exclusive to the Netherlands, but it has been found here. So there's at least some evidence that this is a belief that some people had, at least. There's also an allusion to changelings, which again, it's not exclusive to the Netherlands, but was definitely a thing here. And I think you find that with more folklore. Like there are certain creatures, like they have certain names that are specific to the Netherlands, but the creatures themselves may not necessarily be, because the Netherlands throughout history has been part of other I want to say realm. So it's been part of the French Empire during the time of Napoleon, like part of a bigger Germanic group. So in that sense, it's like hard to say, like, is there something that is super exclusive to the Netherlands?
Yeah.
Not so much. There's a lot of things you find here you might also find in, for example, Germany. But yeah, all the same, I do think it's a Dutch novel.
That's very interesting. You're raising a great point, which I think if you spend any time thinking about how Europe is now structured, at one point none of these countries were a country, right? Like in some cases, like the name that they're based on, it didn't even exist yet, right? And so you're raising a point that, you know, the further back you go, right, the Netherlands as we understand it doesn't exist. It's a bunch of other different sort of kingdoms and things of that nature. And so that would create a lot of fluidity, and probably shared folklore would have to be moving across there, right? And in some way, this book is also, because the bog body, which is we've been focused on, right? It is not unique only to that region. It's all, there's a lot of, as you pointed out, even in Florida, which I have questions Florida, but still, right? So there must be, I imagine this is like where you both have been probably having a lot of fun looking at like how other cultures have responded to bog bodies in Europe, because I imagine they found all kinds of strange and unusual facts about bog bodies by uncovering them, setting aside the unfortunate fact that most of them were discovered before maybe we understood preservation practices, which is sad. Hopefully we didn't miss too much, but yeah. Okay, I want to ask a question then, because you'd mentioned earlier, and I think this is one of the most interesting parts about the book that is not supernatural or strange and about madness, which is you'd mentioned the gender elements here and how rigidly that was structured. And you immediately drew to my mind in the moment where Sarah is talking about like writing the letter of their discovery and their discussing of it. She makes a very specific point that there are certain things she won't say out loud because it would be considered basically too crude for someone of her station to say out loud or for a woman to say. And there are later moments where even Michael or Mikhail, who will say things like, this is how men behave and this is how women behave. And so you've woven that throughout this book in a variety of different ways. It's sort of this undercurrent of the sort of gender dynamics of late 19th century the Netherlands, and I was kind of curious about what was really interesting to you about exploring that theme and then really sort of weaving that into the book. What was the process like for that?
So I did a minor in gender and sexuality, and so of course, like the 19th century is not the same as the early modern period, but I did write about my thesis I wrote on female love in early modern poetry, and then one of the things I had to look into was gender and how people construed gender in that time. And one of the things you notice as soon as you start to look at gender from a historic perspective is how fake it is, right? I mean, if you've read Judith Butler, you know that gender is something we create. So it's not to say like it's not real because we do experience it, but it's very much a construct, something we construe ourselves. And I think the more you look at history, the more you realize that. And especially also if you look at different cultures. So for example, for the early modern period, and I'll promise I'll circle this back to the book,
Sure.
is there was this really interesting shift from marriage being seen as something you did for status and convenience, and where men were believed to have the most important relationship in their life be with another man, specifically their bestie. So the relationship with their wife was secondary. That was definitely not the most important relationship or the most intense love they would experience. That was for their male best friend. And then during the early modern period, due to a whole combination of factors, you see that shift, so that by the end of the early modern period, people actually believe, like, no, the most important relationship for both men and women is the relationship with their spouse. And one of the reasons why that could develop that way is because people started to look at sources from antiquity describing friendship and saying, like, this is what a perfect friend should be like, and they name certain characteristics that were gendered male in the time of the Romans. But by the time the early modern period rolls around, some of those characteristics are no longer considered masculine but feminine. So now women can claim, like, actually, I can be a great best friend because look, I have these traits. Like, these are feminine traits. So I think the more you look into gender, right, the more you realize it's kind of made up. Like we're making it up as we go along, right? And the fact that people have to enforce it so harshly consistently proves that it's not natural, because if it was natural and innate, we wouldn't have to enforce it. So for Blood on Her Tongue, that is something I wanted to explore because the Gothic itself is always about deviancy, it's about taboo, and it always has been about, I think, violating gender norms. So what I thought was interesting is to have Michael or Michael have these very strict ideas about this is what a man should do and this is what a woman should do, and he's like sort of consistently proven wrong about this. And that's the interesting thing about him as a character, right? He has these very strict ideas about this is what a man should be like and this is what a woman should be like, and yet he marries the one woman who very clearly doesn't adhere to this. It's like, okay, you're kind of like you're the maker of your own unhappiness in that sense, because you either need to let go of this idea of gender or you should have found yourself a different person to marry. So that is one of the things that I wanted to sort of add in there. And then I think it also just ties into sort of the twin dynamic, where you have, traditionally speaking, people always think, right, there's one dominant and one submissive twin. And I think as a triplet that that is probably true. But people always think that that's like a very strong dynamic, like a very strong dominant person and one who's very submissive. That's not necessarily the case. But in order for that to work, I did think like, oh, it would be interesting to have one of them, like Sarah, be a bit more masculine and dominant in that sense, and then Lucy is more traditionally feminine and submissive. And then throughout the book, we sort of see that twist in interesting ways too.
I agree. Yeah, their relationship, and in particular, watching Lucy sort of develop in the story, I thought was really interesting. But it helps that we get her point of view and we get to see how she thinks about things. Yeah. Kendra, you look like you want to jump in. Please. Yeah, go.
Yeah. It's about Andrew's character because he doesn't fit this traditional masculine image either. He's kind of seen as the soft. Maybe that's because he's the doctor of sorts, but kind of the soft, more gentle, understanding. At least in the initial part of the books, he's portrayed like that. How did you foresee bringing his character in comparison with Michael?
I mean, I guess they're sort of foils to each other as well, right? Where one of them is like the very, I want to say alpha male douchebag a little bit, and the other one is the nice guy. I mean, they're not in that sense. I would say like, are they the most realistic characters ever? No, but again, they serve a purpose. To sort of show the two sides of the same coin of like toxic masculinity, where one of them is very clearly. I mean, Mikhail is very obvious, right, in the way he is toxic. Though I think like lots of people are like, oh, we hated him. I don't think that is completely fair. I do think he has some redeeming qualities, but overall, he's very clearly not a great guy. And for Arthur, it's interesting because he initially seems like such a like understanding, empathetic man, and then I mean, like I don't want to spoil it too much, but then there is definitely a bit of a twist there, and I think the main problem there is just, I mean, and that sounds very cynical maybe, but I think it's just hard for a man, especially in the 19th century, to sort of divorce themselves from certain patriarchal ideas, right? Where it's hard if you're always being raised with the idea that women are inferior, you don't have to listen to them, you don't have to take them that seriously. It's really hard to sort of change that mindset, especially in the situation where these characters find themselves in. It's very high stress, there's a lot of crazy stuff happening. So of course he's not ultimately going to listen to Lucy, and I mean, I guess that makes sense because from his perspective things are definitely going crazy.
Yeah. He didn't expect her to flip like, complete 180.
Because that's what some people said, right, about the book, where they said, oh, I didn't like the ending because I think the men had a really good point. It's like, okay, but that's like a feature, not a bug. It's true that they have, from their perspective, like their actions make sense. Doesn't mean that they're like nice, but there's definitely they're all morally great characters for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think it's
And
important.
my apologies. I meant Arthur, not Andrew. Sorry, Arthur.
There's a really good point about the way that characters behave, or the way people, I should say, behave, right? Which is that you can have people who are trying to solve the right problem, may or may not necessarily find the right solution to that, but they are correct that there is a problem that needs to be addressed. But that doesn't necessarily make them like heroic or good or perfect angels. If anything, you can have complicated characters who are, to some degree, I would say like sympathetic, the male characters, because I picked up a lot of what you're talking about, that right from the beginning. I mean, I don't even quite entirely believe Mihail in the way he talks. It almost felt to me like he was just repeating things he was taught, and that I have to be forceful with it. I must say it, and it almost never felt like he was 100% actually there. It's like cultural conditioning is what it came across to me, and that's the same with Arthur, and who I think has a very similar thing, and I think that makes them. Yeah, I don't necessarily want to like invite them to tea, because especially Mihail, because he's a little volatile for me, and I don't want him yelling at me. But both of them are sort of these characters who you can kind of feel, like you can understand why they behave the way that they behave. you don't necessarily agree with it. And you can understand the logic for the end of the book, but that's kind of the point, I think, to some degree, is that they are meant to be these characters who are representative of a very particular time and a very particular set of masculine forms, and that comes with all of the warts that you would expect.
Yeah, and the ending is sort of like the ending is in a way. I mean, some people say, "Oh, it's a good for her ending," and that's true to a certain extent. On the other hand, it is kind of a tragedy as well.
Yeah.
Because
Yes,
again, like
yes.
I don't want to say like, "Oh, these men are awesome." They're not, but from their point of view, it's understandable why they do what they do.
Yeah. Yeah. Got to think about the point of view. Yeah. Agreed. Let's talk about madness a little bit, because this is a book that I I think is just dripping with it, because this is the fundamental premise at the beginning, right? Which is Sarah has it appears to be going mad, losing her mind, experiencing bouts of insanity. Or I should say, well, this would be the second bout, but that's a whole other thing that we might need to talk about later. Um, and it seemed to be that in this book, one of the interesting things that you were doing was really teasing at the edges of what is actually real and supernatural versus things that just seem unusual because somebody is experiencing a mental breakdown. And you teased that out for so much of the book, where you had me wondering at one point, like, is this just they're just going mad? Is that what's happening? Because so much of the book has that gothic feel where, even when you get to that moment where you think something isn't quite natural, right? We don't always get the like clean answer, and you do that really effectively here. And I don't know if that was intentional, that you were just really teasing at the edges of the how madness really works in this book. But I was hoping you could talk about just exploring madness in the way that you have, with this undercurrent of the supernatural that for much of the book is, I think, very subdued, especially for the characters who don't believe in it.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to do is sort of invite the reader to sort of experience this, I want to say mental breakdown in a way. Um, because I think we all have sort of preconceived notions of what it would be like to be like quote unquote mad. Um, but I think like it probably is a pretty scary state to be in, right? So that's something I wanted to explore through this book. And mainly what I thought was interesting is if you don't immediately get a clear answer, right? Is it a vampire, yes or no? Is it something else? Is this madness? Because I mean, part of that is just from a craft point of view, because it is if you keep it a mystery longer, hopefully it will create tension, it will propel the reader. Um, so yeah, it's a useful tool to keep the reader reading. On the other hand, I also think this is something that is interesting to explore in general, the whole line between what is sanity and what is madness. Specifically, if you look at the 19th century, and I have to say the depiction of asylums in this book is really black and white. Like the reality of the history of the insane asylum is far more nuanced than what I did here. That's because I'm writing a gothic novel, and the mental asylum is a trope in the gothic horror novel. But ultimately, right, a lot of people who were committed in the 19th century will probably not be committed today, for this simple reason that some of them were not actively suffering from what we now understand to be mental health issues, but from, for example, neurological conditions. Some of them were, like, for example, people who suffered from tertiary syphilis. That's another thing where it does affect the brain, by the way.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you could say, I guess you're mad, but there's a very clear physical cause for that. Another, like, if you just look at, for example, a list of these people were committed in this year in the 19th century, and these were the reasons. Some of them read very, very strangely. For example, women. I mean, for masturbation is one reason that we see multiple times, but also, for example, excessive grief. So, for
Oh,
example, a man who lost his child and has a really hard time coping, who's then committed to an insane asylum because, oh, the grief he experiences is excessive. Another thing would be aggression, like antisocial behavior. Other things might be, I think, for women, like if you look for like women, you get some really, really weird reasons. Like, has an excessive interest in mathematics, for example, is one I saw. Another would be Oh, I'm trying to think because there's a lot of really weird spiritualism, like an interest in, for example, seances and spiritualism could potentially get you committed. So there's a lot of things there that we would not necessarily commit people for now, and that is
Mm.
interesting in and of itself because our perception of what is madness has changed over time. And I thought it would be interesting to explore that, like, if our perceptions of madness can change, what does that mean? For example, if we look at how we perceive madness now over in like 100 years' time, maybe some of the things where we think, okay, this is severe, like mental health issues or madness, or people in 100 years might think something very differently. Like maybe they're going to discover that there's a reason why people who are now diagnosed with a certain thing were behaving. Maybe not. Like, but the idea that in that sense, like I guess mental health issues or madness are a social construct just as gender is. And of course, like there's undeniably people who do struggle with mental health issues, right? Who do have very severe symptoms. But at the same time, what we consider madness is not has not always been.
Mm.
It doesn't stay the same. So in that sense, I think it's interesting to explore that in a gothic novel where you invite the reader to sort of experience this mental breakdown. I would say alongside with the characters and to continuously have them question like, is this madness? Yes or no? And I mean, ultimately, I think the follow-up question would be like, even if it was, don't these people, like, don't these characters deserve adequate medical care, love, affection, rather than what they're getting, which is a whole other kettle of fish.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was my fascination with madness and exploring that in this novel.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting reading the ways that you present Sarah, for example, who um you know is initially presented to us as well in two different ways because again, as I mentioned, you have the letters, right? But then there are the letters where she's very cogent, and then there are letters where it's almost like we're in her mind hearing the the words just like being vomited out. But as you kind of explore her experience, she has these very interesting moments where she's seemingly completely not with the rest of us in these moments and then almost fully cogent physically. And I found that really interesting to read in the story, I think, because for me, um, the more interesting question for her character was kind of the question you were raising, which is like, where is that actual line at? Um, at what point do we go, she's experiencing something and she needs to be sent to an asylum, which they basically ask at the very beginning of the book if that's what should have happened. Or is she experiencing something that is causing these symptoms, kind of how you're describing, like today we might find an answer for why someone gets a condition and it turns out it's an answer we can solve, right? That is part of this book as well. And you explored in a time period where they just are severely limited in what is available to them at that moment. And I think that creates, I don't know, as the writer, it must have been something you're definitely trying to create a lot of tension. But to me, it created like I'm like goosebump levels of tension where once we start getting questionable questions and answers to things, me sitting there just being like, okay, but like what's the next piece to this? What is the unveiling of the mystery? So this is not a question. This is me just saying you did a good job. I'm sorry.
Good to know. Like I think, for example, I read Paul Tremblay's A Head Full of Ghosts, and I found that really, really impressive because what I felt with that book is, and I think if you look at, for example, what people thought demon possession looks like, and what we now know to be, for example, psychosis or schizophrenia, like these symptoms are very similar to the point that a lot of people who were probably thought to be possessed back in the day probably experienced something like acute onset like psychosis or a form of schizophrenia. I mean, it's always difficult, right, to diagnose people from your armchair
Yeah.
back in history, but it's likely. And I think what that book did really well is it really made me question, like, is this a demon possession or is this schizophrenia? And that is something I've found very, very effective, and that is something I definitely wanted to explore in this book as well. Because you could read Blood on Her Tongue as a possession story of some sort. But yeah, I thought that was like I think that is genuine chilling, right? Where you're like, I think this might be one thing, but it potentially could be this other thing. But which one is it?
Yeah, they have completely different solutions depending on which one it is. Yeah. Kendra, do you want to jump in?
I wanted to talk a little bit about trauma.
Yeah.
Because trauma makes an appearance in this book, and it does quite overtly in My Darling Dreadful Thing. What is so interesting about this is that Sarah's trauma is very explicit, very clear, whereas Lucy's is a bit more subtle. Um, did you have that in plan with regards to the more dominant and kind of submissive twin? Were you thinking about in the sense that, well, Lucy doesn't really up much or share much, so we kind of have to tease what she's struggling with out of her as readers as we go through the novel?
Yes, because she's quite reserved, right? She bottles a
Yeah.
lot of stuff up. Sarah's the opposite. She wears her heart on her sleeve. I have to say, I don't think I thought of it this consciously, but I think now that you say it, like, yeah, it makes sense. Now that was in the book.
Yeah, because one of the interesting things too, like when we get to Sarah's transformation, and when the two males start to question whether or not she's mad or how mad is she, what's often brought up is her losing her child. And that is a big traumatic and significant event. And so their understanding of what's happening is kind of wrapped around that. And also Lucy, initially too. But then Lucy starts to see, well, this is a bit more peculiar, a bit stranger. And then Lucy starts to share a bit more in tangent about her relationship with Sarah as children and as just the sisterly bond. So it's interesting how Sarah's trauma kind of almost leads Lucy to um, reconsider or kind of remember her experiences. And I would say too, I mean, maybe you could comment on this. Um, that kind of acts as like the propeller for her growth.
Mm.
Yes, one of the things I wanted to explore in this book as well, I mean, it's all about identity.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's be real. Like, to what extent can you change and still be the same person, right? Um, but yeah, I think the thing about the twins is that they're so closely linked that in that sense, and I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, if my sister were to have a child that died, I would probably be pretty traumatized by that too. But they share a lot. At the same time, right, they do keep secrets, but it makes sense for her to sort of experience it alongside Sarah in that sense, and then to sort of reconsider certain things. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of character growth for Lucy, I would say. Um, a lot of high stress moments that definitely force her to rethink some things.
Yeah.
Yeah, to also almost think of herself apart from Sarah too,
Mm.
as we move throughout or progress through the book. She starts to see herself as more than just Sarah's sister, and she kind of takes on that agency.
Yeah, no, that's true because initially she allows Sarah to always lead her, right? And that's no longer an option.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, no.
Sorry, my brain just went in like 6 different directions, and I was trying to get it to focus on one because I can't ask you 6 different questions. Uh, um, so, so there was an interesting little detail since we're talking about trauma, and I'm going to assume that you did some research, and I'm just going to ask you to talk about it because you mentioned that that Sarah's lost her child, and there is a photo that is taken after the child has passed, which I am aware is a thing that people used to do. And I'm assuming you also are aware that that's a thing that people used to do. And that is something today that I think just feels alien to us. I think it feels not loving. It feels disturbing to us. And yet I don't know if you know or aware what the motivations are for what would make people to take basically photographs of their deceased children. I don't know, like talk about that because
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's like the the postmortem photography. It's not something people did with just children, also other people. It basically stems from the time where having your photograph taken is so expensive that it's not something people usually do. So when a loved one passes away and you realize like, oh, this is the last time I'm going to see them, that might be the time where you're like, okay, now I need to get a picture of them because as soon as they're going in the ground, I have nothing to remember their face by. And I think that must be one of the genuine horrors of grief, especially for people back in the day where you would slowly forget what your loved one looked like over time, right? If you didn't have a picture of them. And the way, because there's this whole trend going on, right? I think maybe you've seen it where people are holding up pictures from the Victorian era and it's like, look, which one of those people is dead? Like, find the dead one.
Oh
Um,
my gosh.
it's a thing, yeah. Like where people are like, which one of them is dead. I think a lot of them are, by the way, they're not like none of a lot of those pictures. A lot of those people are not dead. Like I mean, nowadays they are, but they weren't dead when the photo was taken. But yeah, often they were sort of dressed up, sort of peacefully. And certain actions were taken to sort of make them look like less super dead, which is understandable, I think, because if you want a picture to remember your loved one, you don't want them to look like super corpse like.
Yeah.
So yeah, like it looks very macabre to us, but it's very much done out of, I think, love for your loved one and a way to help cope with that grief. And you have to understand that people in the 19th century had a very different understanding of death as compared to we do nowadays, especially I think American death culture is really extreme and in how sanitized it is, where I think if you, for example, look at Caitlin Dowdy's channel, Ask a Mortician, what you will find in her comments is that people find it very refreshing how she talks about death, because one of the things she does is explain sort of what happens, right, when we die, but also the process of how to get a funeral or a cremation. Because a lot of people don't really know the answers to these questions because it's not something that people talk about. But what you also will find in her comment section, which I personally found very sad and shocking, is many people talking about how traumatic it was for them to see a corpse, especially a corpse for a loved one, because they're not used to seeing a dead body. Um, and that is so different from how it used to be. And like in America especially, right, death is treated as something kind of dirty. It's not normal for American people to keep a deceased loved one at home with them. There's a very large push for embalming. And that was interesting, by the way, because I had to add a line in the book mentioning specifically that Sarah, like it's this thing about embalming. I don't want to spoil it too much, and I had to add that in for the American reader because my editor was like, "Well, you need to tell them that this body is not embalmed because otherwise, none of this could have happened, right? If the body was embalmed." And I had to explain to her, okay, that's true, but embalming is not usual in Europe. It's still like it's an option now in the Netherlands. I think it's been legal for around 15 years at this point, but before that, it wasn't even legal to embalm bodies. You would just dress them up nicely, put them on ice for a bit, and then either cremate or bury them. But like American death culture is very, oh, the corpse is a dirty thing. You can't keep it at home with you. You have to immediately embalm it because that's what a lot of people will tell you, right? If the body's not embalmed, it's dirty. It's a biohazard, and none
Yeah.
of that is true. Like unless the person died of maybe Ebola, in which case yes, it is a biohazard. And I understand very much that like embalming nowadays is part of American death culture. For certain subcultures, it's very important. And I also understand that, for example, in Texas in summer, that's your best option. So
Yeah.
like no shade, right, to people who choose embalming. But that's just so different from how it used to be. Like back in the day, in the 19th century, if that person died, you would keep them at home with you. You would probably,
Yeah.
like depending on like how close you were to this person, you might have washed them, you might have dressed them, you might have sat with them, you might have
Yeah.
talked to them. And that is something I also find like deeply fascinating. So there's a bunch of stuff in this book that sounds very, I want to say, just plainly fucked up from a modern perspective, but is not necessarily that for the characters because they just live in such a different time period and have such a different deaf culture.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that I found very interesting too is you'd mentioned at the very beginning of this that in the Gothic, right, the issue of like the taboo, and as I was reading this and kind of hearing you also talking in particular about this particular issue of the photography, you raise I think an element that I don't know if it was intentional in your book, but is this idea that we're reading a time that's 150 approximately years ago, and we're reading about their perceptions of taboos, and then things they do are things that, depending on your culture now, we might consider to be taboo. Right? So like the idea of taking photographs of your deceased loved one, I don't know anybody, at least in the United States, who would do that. That would not be considered normal. If you walked around with photos of like your deceased children, like that after they had, like that would, people would think that was strange in this country.
Oh, that's
Uh,
interesting because my uncle's an undertaker. I definitely know people who do take pictures of their dead loved ones. They're
really?
private, right? It's not something you would share. It's not like, oh, like grandma's coming to tea, let's whip out the photo album of the dead relatives.
Yeah.
But it is definitely something people might potentially do to help them with their process of grieving. It's not always like recommended, but for example, an example would be if somebody was in like had a sort of illness that meant they had a great pain, like were in great pain before they died. As soon as they pass away, like the muscles of the face finally relax, so it's no longer, so they
Yeah.
finally look like they're at peace, right? Some people do make pretty corpses in that sense. And then it can be very healing for the family to have pictures to look at them. And so
Yeah.
like yeah, it's not like I understand. I kind of understand for Americans that Americans wouldn't necessarily do that because I think again, deaf culture in America is pretty extreme. The Netherlands is a bit more, I would say, more like closer to that traditional 19th century deaf culture.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, like
Interesting.
that's interesting, right? Like that's sort of a taboo in America. Like I know people who have done this in the Netherlands, and again, it's not something you would advertise, but it's not something that people would think is extremely odd.
Ah, interesting. So
Yeah, I
there's
agree with.
yeah. Go ahead, Kendra. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, no, because I also know people who have had family members pass away and that they kept them in the house and had people come see them. They dress them and everything here, and so it's very different
Yeah.
than it is in the States. There is this kind of rush to get them out, get them clean, get them dressed in American deaf culture. So yeah,
Interesting. So it's my culture has got a weirdness going on here. Hmm. I have to
Yeah,
really
I
think
think
about
so.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I think American deaf culture is a bit too extreme in that it sanitizes deaf completely, and I don't think that
I
is
agree.
always healthy for the people left behind. I guess the Netherlands, in that sense, I would argue is better. Like if I have no like family members who passed away who were kept at home, and you could like sit with them, you could talk to them, you could hold their hand. I mean, I have to say, like, in that sense, embalming is pretty nice because if you put them on a cold slab, yeah, that's
Yeah.
they definitely feel like a corpse, right? If you embalm
yeah, they're
them,
cold. Yeah.
yeah, if you embalm them, potentially if you keep holding their hand, it would take on like the temperature of your hand. And then that's a very strange sensation too, because then it kind of feels like a living person's hand for a little
Yeah.
bit. So that's a whole other potential trauma there, I would say. But it could also help with the grieving process. Like I think
Yeah.
I would have to look into this more, right? So from a psychological point of view, but there's a reason why we want to see people after they've passed away because it helps us to understand like they are truly dead, they are truly gone, and now I can start grieving them. And if you, for example, don't see a person after they died, I mean, that's why it's so traumatic, right? When people die in, for example, a natural disaster, we are very certain they are dead, but we, for example, can't retrieve the body, so we have to bury an empty casket and people can't see the body, and that's traumatic to people if they can't say
Yeah.
goodbye to their loved one like that.
Yeah, there's no closure.
Yeah. That is so. I mean, you're completely right that I think in American culture we sanitize or yeah, we basically sanitize death in a lot of cases. Certainly not universally. There are subcultures here where that wouldn't be the case, but the idea, like in my family, that we would even have the body present, right? Is no. We don't even do like the casket's not there when we do the sort of the funeral, as it were. The body's actually already been handled. That's at least in my family, mostly it's been cremations. That's done effectively. We're there, there's pictures up, and we're there with all the friends in the family and people sharing stories. That's the way we kind of deal with that. And like when people tell me like, oh well, we had like the casket there, I don't know what that experience is like. I have no way to know what it feels like to be in the room because I've never been in a room with with the deceased's body. I've never been there. And so you're making me really think about all of these things of like, well, is that, I wonder what my wife, because my wife's from Vietnam, I'll have to look and see what hers is culture is like, because that's now a thing we're going to have to think about. There's like stuff going in my head right now. I have so many thoughts. Yeah.
So many.
So many. I do think it's so interesting, though, that because this book is available in the United States, right? If you're like an American reading this, I think it's super interesting to get that different point of view from a different culture that just is not quite like your home culture, to see how they react to these things. Because as you're kind of pointing out, the Netherlands, some of these kinds of activities would not be, it wouldn't be considered extreme or strange, really. They might be not extremely common in some cases. Whereas in, most of the United States, which some of your readers will be like, that this will be alien to them. And I find that interesting, because that's a moment where hopefully they'll sit down and go, well, wait a minute, why is it like this? What is the reasoning? Well, why are different cultures the way that they are with their different burial practices? Yeah. Again, not a question. This is fascinating to me. That's what I'm getting at.
Very fascinating.
It's very fascinating. Kendra, do you have a last question before we start closing out?
No, I don't think so. I think you pretty much covered everything.
Everything
When's
we
your
can
next
without
book? Actually,
spoiling it.
yeah. Well, I probably spoiled it a bit. I'm sorry. When is your next book? When can we look forward to the next book from you?
So I actually have a middle grade book coming out on the 26th of August this year. So that is
Oh.
my next book. It is spooky, fantastical adventure. So I would say like it's still. I mean, if you aren't traumatizing the kids, are you doing it right? No, that's no, that's like it's not that scary. It's a little spooky, right? But it's mainly like adventurous. So that is something I'm really looking forward to. My middle grade debut. As for more adult horror stuff, that would be 2026 spring. I don't know the exact date yet, but I am definitely working on my next horror novel. Yeah.
Cool.
Yay!
And then if folks would like to find you and your books and so on, where would they go?
So I have an Instagram, Johanna van Veen. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one out there with that handle. So I think there's more Johanna van Veens around, but I know a lot of them. So yeah, you can find me on Instagram. I am also on TikTok. I'm less active there though. And as for my books, basically anywhere books are sold.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for being here on the show and talking to us about the book and giving me the opportunity to read this, because I really like the book.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And Kendra, thank you.
Thank you. In a while.
You helped make this happen, and then I got to chat with you, and we both got to chat with Johanna here. So this is wonderful. So thank you, Kendra, for coming.
It's been my pleasure. I'm hoping that we can do this with some other Dutch authors. I'm really getting into the Dutchy writer scene here.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to close out the show for folks that will be watching this or listening to it later. So, folks, this is the end of the show. If you'd like to let us know what you thought about the episode, if you read this book, Blood on Her Tongue, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you. skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. If you're on our Patreon Discord, you can also talk to us in there and say hi. We're on Blue Sky, Threads, Mastodon, YouTube, a whole bunch of places. You can go to skiffyandfanty.com/skiffythings. There's links to all of that. We are live every Friday, 7 p.m. Central at twitch.tv/alphabetstreams. And then if you like what we do, patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. And because Kendra's a guest, I'm not going to make you read out all the names. We're going to skip it this time because I feel like that's unfair. So I'm not going to make you do that. So for folks at home, if you'd like to find me, ShaunDuke.net, Alphabet Streams on Twitch, ShaunDuke.net/DukeThings if you want to find all of my nonsense and my social things. So as required by the Skiffy and Fanty bylaws, I need to make it happy because that is the bylaw for 2025. We always have to make every episode end happily. And so despite reading a book of very terrifying things and characters who are unnaturally hungry and want to drink your blood and tea, I'm going to give us a happier note, which will be that Kendra and I have finally been able to see each other again after over about a decade since the last time. And
It's been a long time.
I miss Kendra terribly. And so it was Kendra, you're awesome. That's your happy note. All right. And on that note, happy ending and scene.